house had stood for over a century, a grand Victorian with turrets and gables that seemed to stretch toward the heavens. For generations, the Carmichael family had called it home, but beneath its polished wooden floors and intricately carved staircases, secrets were buried deep. On a quiet spring afternoon, Evelyn Carmichael, now in her late 70s, found herself drawn to the attic, a place she hadn't dared enter in decades. There, amidst cobwebs and forgotten heirlooms, she uncovered a dusty chest. Inside were letters, photographs, and a single tarnished locket that bore an inscription she couldn't ignore. To my beloved, for all the years we'll never have, Evelyn Carmichael had lived her life with grace and dignity. A widow for 20 years, she filled her days with gardening, volunteering, and doting on her grandchildren. Her life seemed ordinary to those around her, but Evelyn carried a weight she'd never spoken of. Not even to her late husband, Richard. Her childhood in Charleston, South Carolina, had been idyllic on the surface, but the whispers of scandal had followed her family. Her father, a charismatic businessman, was known for his charm and ruthlessness. Her mother, fragile and enigmatic, rarely left her room. Evelyn remembered her mother's trembling hands and tearful goodbyes before disappearing one summer night when Evelyn was just 14. The family never spoke of her mother again. Now, decades later, standing in the dimly lit attic of her Connecticut home, Evelyn felt her mother's presence as though she had just left the room. The locket, cold and heavy in her hand, seemed to thrum with energy. She carefully unfolded the letters, their delicate paper brittle with age. Each one began with, "My dearest Margaret," and ended with, "Forever yours, H." The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. Evelyn's breath caught as she realized these letters weren't from her father. The photographs revealed a younger version of her mother, laughing with a man Evelyn had never seen. They were intimate moments captured on film, moments her father could never have known about. One letter stood out. "My Margaret, I cannot wait for the day we can finally leave all this behind. I've saved enough for us to start anew. Charleston will be a distant memory, and we'll build a life free from the shadows of the past. Meet me at the train station on August 17th, just before dawn. If you're not there, I'll know you've chosen to stay." August 17th, Evelyn's birthday. Her mind raced. Had her mother planned to leave them all behind that day? If she had, why hadn't she gone? And who was H? She felt a pang of guilt for prying into a past her mother had never shared, but a deeper yearning for answers spurred her on. Evelyn spent the rest of the day carefully packing the chest's contents and carrying them downstairs. Later that evening, Evelyn called her daughter, Melissa. "Mom, are you okay? You sound different," Melissa asked. Evelyn hesitated. "I found something today, about Grandma Margaret. Something I can't quite make sense of." Melissa sighed. "Grandma Margaret? Mom, you know she left so long ago. We don't even know what happened to her." "Exactly," Evelyn said, gripping the phone tightly. "And I think I've just found the beginning of the answer." Melissa was quiet for a moment before replying. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No," Evelyn said firmly. The next morning, Evelyn woke early and made a list of names. She recalled her father's friends and associates, as well as anyone who might still be alive to remember those days in Charleston. Her heart ached with both trepidation and excitement as she booked a flight south. Returning to Charleston was like stepping into a dream. The cobblestone streets and sprawling oaks draped with Spanish moss hadn't changed, but the city felt smaller, as though time had shrunk it. Her first stop was the county archives. The clerk, a kindly older man named Walter, helped her locate property records for her childhood home. The name Hiram Blackwell appeared in connection with her family's estate. "Hiram Blackwell?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. "Who was he?" Walter adjusted his glasses. "He was a builder, worked on some of the finest homes in Charleston. But he disappeared under strange circumstances. I think it was back in the 40s. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "Do you know what happened to him?" Walter shook his head. "No one does, ma'am. One day he just vanished. There were rumors, something about a love affair gone wrong. But that's all anyone ever said." Evelyn's next stop was her old home. The grand estate was now a boutique hotel, its sweeping verandas filled with tourists sipping sweet tea. She wandered through the gardens, now meticulously maintained, and felt a rush of memories. As she stood by the wrought iron gate, a voice startled her. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Evelyn turned to see a woman about her age, with striking silver hair and a warm smile. "I used to live here," Evelyn said. "I'm just visiting." The woman introduced herself as Clara, the hotel's manager. When Evelyn mentioned her mother, Clara's expression shifted. "Margaret Carmichael?" Clara said softly. "I remember stories about her when I was a girl. My grandmother used to work here as a housekeeper." Evelyn's heart leapt. "Do you know anything about what happened to her?" Clara hesitated before nodding. "Come with me." She led Evelyn to a small storage room filled with old furniture and artifacts from the house's history. Clara rummaged through a box and pulled out a framed photograph. "This was my grandmother," Clara said, pointing to a young woman in a maid's uniform standing beside Evelyn's mother. She always said Margaret was the kindest soul she'd ever met, but she also said Margaret was troubled, afraid of something or someone. Clara handed Evelyn another item, a faded journal. "This belonged to my grandmother. I think there's something in here you'll want to see." That evening, Evelyn sat in her hotel room, the journal open in her lap. As she read, the pieces began to fall into place. The entries painted a picture of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, yearning for freedom but bound by duty. One entry stopped Evelyn cold. "Margaret told me she couldn't leave, not without her daughter. But her husband found out about Hiram. He threatened to ruin her and take Evelyn away if she tried to leave. Margaret told me she had no choice." Evelyn stared at the words, her mind racing. Her father had known about the affair, and he had used Evelyn as leverage to keep her mother from leaving. Tears welled in her eyes as she thought of her mother's sorrow, her sacrifice. But the mystery wasn't over. What had happened to Hiram? And why had her mother disappeared? Late that night, Evelyn received a call from Melissa. "Nam, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "But I've just uncovered something that changes everything." "Like what?" Evelyn looked at the photograph of her mother and Hiram. "I think I'm finally going to find out the truth." Evelyn Carmichael's discovery of her mother's past had shaken her to her core. The journal, the letters, and the locket had cast shadows over the family history she thought she knew. But they had also awakened a determination within her. She would not let these secrets remain buried. The night in the Charleston Hotel passed fitfully. Evelyn sat by the window, the sound of cicadas filling the air, as she pored over the journal's fragile pages. Her thoughts circled back to Hiram Blackwell, the man her mother had loved. Who was he truly, and what had become of him? The next morning, Evelyn returned to the county archives, this time armed with questions. Walter, the elderly clerk, greeted her with a knowing smile. "Back for more, Mrs. Carmichael?" "I need everything you have on Hiram Blackwell," she said. Walter raised an eyebrow. "Well, I'll do my best, but like I said, his story is mostly rumors. Give me a minute." As Walter disappeared into the stacks, Evelyn's gaze wandered to an old map of Charleston hanging on the wall. She found herself tracing the streets with her finger, stopping at her childhood home. The map showed how close the train station was, barely a mile away. "Did you ever wonder why your mother didn't go?" she whispered to herself. Walter returned, carrying a thin folder. "This is all I've got." Hiram Blackwell was quite the character, from what I hear. A builder, yes, but also a dreamer. He wanted to design the city's finest landmarks. Evelyn opened the folder. The first item was a faded newspaper clipping from 1947. "Local builder Hiram Blackwell goes missing." The article detailed his sudden disappearance, with vague mentions of a scandal involving a prominent Charleston family. Then she found something that made her heart skip a beat. A photograph of Hiram standing beside a half-built mansion. His face was kind but strong, his eyes full of determination. Evelyn felt a strange pang of recognition. "Do you think he left willingly?" Evelyn asked. Walter shrugged. "Some say he ran off. Others say he met a bad end. Charleston wasn't as genteel as it pretended to be back then. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she examined the photograph again. In the background, barely visible, was a figure standing in the shadows. Evelyn couldn't be sure, but the silhouette looked eerily familiar. "Walter," she said, her voice trembling. "Where was this taken?" "That's the old Ashburn estate," Walter replied. "Abandoned for years now, but back then, it was the talk of the town." Evelyn decided to visit the Ashburn estate. She rented a car and drove out to the edge of town, where the city gave way to sprawling fields and marshland. The mansion loomed in the distance, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of decades. As she approached, she felt a chill. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay. The gates hung open, rusted and barely clinging to their hinges. Inside, the house was a ruin. Sunlight streamed through broken windows, illuminating piles of debris and graffiti-covered walls. But amid the wreckage, Evelyn found something unexpected: a locked door. The wood was splintered, and the lock was old and rusted, but the door itself seemed strangely well-preserved compared to the rest of the house. Evelyn's heart raced as she tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. She searched the room for anything that might help her open it. Behind a fallen beam, she found an old crowbar. With a deep breath, she wedged it into the doorframe and pushed with all her might. The door groaned, then gave way, revealing a small, hidden room. Inside, Evelyn's eyes widened as she took in the sight. A desk, covered in papers, an old suitcase, and most chillingly, a coat draped over a chair. The room felt untouched by time. Evelyn approached the desk, her hands trembling. The papers were letters, all addressed to Margaret Carmichael. "My dearest Margaret, I've made all the arrangements. Meet me at the station on August 17th, just before dawn. I'll wait for you until the last train leaves. After that, I'll know your answer." Evelyn felt a lump in her throat. This was the same date mentioned in the letters she had found in the attic. Hiram had waited for her mother, but why hadn't she gone? Her attention shifted to the suitcase. Inside, she found clothes neatly folded, as though someone had been planning a journey. Beneath them was a pocket watch, its surface engraved with the initials HB. As Evelyn examined the watch, she noticed something strange. The back panel was loose. She pried it open to find a small, folded piece of paper hidden inside. "If I disappear, it's because I've been found out. They warned me to leave Margaret alone, but I couldn't. If anything happens to me, the truth is in the foundation." Evelyn's breath caught. The foundation? What did that mean? As she left the Ashburn estate, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed to move, and the creak of the old house followed her long after she had left its grounds. Back at the hotel, she called Melissa. "Mom, you sound tired," Melissa said. "I found something today," Evelyn replied. "Something that might explain what happened to Hiram Blackwell." Melissa sighed. "Do you think this is a good idea? Digging all this up after so many years?" "I don't have a choice," Evelyn said. "It's not just about him. It's about Mom. I have to know why she stayed." Evelyn spent the next day tracing Hiram's projects. She discovered that he had built several homes in Charleston, including her childhood home. The thought sent shivers down her spine. Could the truth be buried in the very house where she had grown up? Her final stop was a visit to Clara, the hotel manager whose grandmother had known Margaret. Evelyn showed Clara the note from the pocket watch. "The foundation," Clara murmured. "That could mean anything. But if Hiram wrote that, he must have known something important was hidden. Do you think it's still there?" Evelyn asked. Clara nodded slowly. "If it is, you're going to need help finding it." The chapter ends as Evelyn stares at the locket she had found in the attic, her mind racing with possibilities. What could be hidden beneath the foundation of her childhood home? And how far would she go to uncover the truth? The morning sun cast a golden hue over Charleston as Evelyn Carmichael stood in front of her childhood home. Now a bustling boutique hotel, the house seemed to hum with life, but Evelyn's memories of its halls were filled with a mixture of wonder and unease. She tightened her grip on her handbag, the weight of Hiram's note heavy in her mind. The foundation. Hiram's last words had been cryptic, But Evelyn couldn't ignore the possibility that something of great importance had been hidden in the home's very bones. Clara greeted her warmly at the door. "Back so soon?" Clara asked, her sharp eyes scanning Evelyn's face. "I need your help," Evelyn said without hesitation. Clara tilted her head. "Does this have to do with that note?" Evelyn nodded. "I think there's something buried here. Something Hiram Blackwell left behind." Clara led Evelyn to the hotel's basement, which had once been the servants' quarters. The air was damp, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the dimly lit space. Clara flipped a switch, and a single bulb illuminated the low-ceilinged room. "My grandmother used to talk about this place," Clara said. "She said there were areas down here that were boarded up when the family sold the house. If Hiram hid something, it might still be behind those walls." The two women began their search, combing through decades of forgotten furniture, crates, and other remnants of the past. Evelyn's heart raced as she spotted a section of the wall that seemed different. Newer planks of wood had been nailed haphazardly over an older, crumbling structure. "Here," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara grabbed a crowbar and handed it to Evelyn. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Evelyn nodded and began prying the boards loose. The wood groaned under the pressure, and a cloud of dust filled the air as the final plank fell away, revealing a narrow crawlspace. Inside, the light caught on something metallic. Evelyn reached in and pulled out a small, locked box. It was heavy, its iron exterior covered in rust and grime. She turned to Clara, her eyes wide. "We need to open this," Evelyn said. Clara retrieved a set of tools, and together they worked to break the lock. When it finally gave way, Evelyn lifted the lid with trembling hands. Inside were stacks of documents, old photographs, and a bundle of letters tied with a frayed ribbon. Evelyn carefully unfolded one of the letters. "Margaret, they're watching us. Your husband's men have been following me for weeks. I can't let them stop us. If something happens to me, promise me you'll tell Evelyn the truth someday." Evelyn's heart sank. Hiram had been under threat long before his disappearance. Among the papers was a set of blueprints, yellowed with age. Evelyn spread them out on the floor, her eyes scanning the intricate designs. "It's the house," she murmured, tracing the lines with her fingers. But something was off. One section of the basement had been marked with an X, accompanied by a note in Hiram's handwriting. "Here lies the key to her freedom." Evelyn and Clara exchanged a glance. "What does that mean?" Clara asked. "I don't know," Evelyn admitted, "but I think we need to find out." They moved to the marked section of the basement, which was now a storage area for cleaning supplies. Clara helped Evelyn clear the shelves, revealing the bare concrete floor. "This is the spot," Evelyn said, her voice steady. Clara fetched a sledgehammer, and together they began chipping away at the surface. The work was grueling, and sweat dripped down Evelyn's brow as the sound of breaking concrete echoed through the basement. Finally, after what felt like hours, the hammer struck something hollow. Clara grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the hole they had made. Beneath the concrete was a small metal hatch. Evelyn knelt and carefully opened the hatch. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the initials HB. The journal's pages were filled with Hiram's handwriting. Evelyn flipped through them, her breath catching as she read his words. "I loved Margaret more than I thought possible. She deserved more than the life she had. But her husband, he's a monster. He threatened to destroy her, to take Evelyn away. He made me swear to leave Charleston forever, or he would ruin them both. I couldn't abandon her, so I stayed, hoping to protect her from the shadows." Evelyn's hands shook as she read the final entry. "They found me. Tonight I'll confront him. If I don't return, Margaret, know that I did this for you, for Evelyn. The truth is here in these pages, and in the room where he thinks his power is safe." Evelyn closed the journal, her mind racing. Hiram had intended to confront her father, knowing it could cost him his life. But what had he meant by the room where he thinks his power is safe? Evelyn and Clara took the journal upstairs, where they spread the papers and photographs out on a table. Evelyn's eyes were drawn to a photograph of her father standing in his study, a proud smile on his face. The study had been her father's sanctuary, a place where he conducted his business behind closed doors. That's it, Evelyn said. His study. If Hiram hid something else, it would be there. The study had been converted into a reading room for the hotel's guests. But the furniture and fixtures were largely unchanged. Evelyn and Clara searched every inch of the room, their efforts fruitless until Evelyn noticed a loose panel on the wall behind the bookshelf. With Clara's help, she pried the panel free, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, intricately carved box. Evelyn opened it to find a collection of documents, bank statements, deeds, and contracts. But one document stood out, a confession, written in her father's handwriting. Evelyn read the confession aloud, her voice breaking. I destroyed the man my wife loved. Hiram Blackwell was a threat to my reputation, and I couldn't allow Margaret to leave with him. I paid men to ensure he disappeared, but they went too far. His blood is on my hands, and I will carry this guilt to my grave. Evelyn sank into a chair, her chest tight. Her father's pride and jealousy had destroyed Hiram and shattered her mother's chance at happiness. As the weight of the truth settled over her, Evelyn knew her journey was far from over. There was one final question she needed answered. What had happened to her mother after Hiram's death? Evelyn Carmichael sat in the dim light of the reading room, her hands trembling as she held her father's confession. The truth about Hiram Blackwell's fate was laid bare, but her heart ached with an even greater question. What had become of her mother, Margaret? Why had she disappeared after enduring so much? Clara broke the silence. Evelyn, are you okay? Evelyn shook her head. No, I don't think I'll be okay until I understand why my mother vanished. She stayed, she sacrificed. But then she was gone. The next morning, Evelyn returned to the archives. Her resolve hardened. Walter greeted her with a worried smile. You look like a woman on a mission, he said. I need everything you have on Margaret Carmichael after 1947, Evelyn said firmly. Any records, train tickets, property transfers, anything that could tell me where she went or what happened to her. Walter nodded and disappeared into the stacks. Evelyn drummed her fingers on the desk, her mind racing through possibilities. Her mother had been trapped in a loveless marriage, blackmailed into staying. Hiram's death must have devastated her. But why hadn't she taken Evelyn and fled? Walter returned with a slim file. Not much here, he admitted. But I did find something interesting. He handed her a copy of an old hospital ledger. One entry stood out. Margaret Carmichael had been admitted to Charleston Mercy Hospital in late August 1947, just weeks after Hiram's disappearance. The reason? Severe exhaustion and emotional distress. She was hospitalized? Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. Walter nodded. It was a different time, ma'am. Women who were seen as overly emotional were often institutionalized. Evelyn's next stop was Charleston Mercy Hospital. Now a modern medical center, its archives were stored in a separate facility. She filled out the necessary forms and waited anxiously as an archivist sifted through decades-old files. After what felt like hours, the archivist returned with a yellow document. Mrs. Carmichael was transferred to a private facility, the archivist said. The records show she was moved to Ashford Asylum in October 1947. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Ashford Asylum? Where is that? It closed down in the 1960s, the archivist replied. But the building still stands. It's about an hour's drive from here. The drive to Ashford Asylum was marked by unease. The road wound through dense woods, the canopy above filtering the sunlight into eerie patterns. When Evelyn finally arrived, she was met with a crumbling facade, ivy crawling over the stone walls. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant caw of crows. Clara had insisted on accompanying her. You're not going in there alone, Clara had said firmly. The two women stood at the asylum's entrance, the massive wooden doors creaking as they pushed them open. Inside, the air was stale, the faint scent of mildew and decay clinging to every surface. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that pierced through shattered windows. Evelyn and Clara combed through the asylum's ruins, searching for any trace of Margaret. The records room was a maze of toppled filing cabinets and scattered papers. Evelyn sifted through them, her hands trembling as she searched for her mother's name. Finally, she found it. Margaret Carmichael's file was thin, but its contents were harrowing. The notes described a woman consumed by grief, plagued by nightmares, and unable to speak of the events that had led her there. One entry stood out. Patient remains unresponsive when asked about her husband or the deceased builder, Hiram Blackwell. She has expressed guilt over a promise she was unable to keep. Recommend continued isolation. Evelyn's heart ached. Her mother had been silenced, her pain dismissed as hysteria. In a corner of the file, Evelyn found a photograph of Margaret taken during her time at Ashford. Her once vibrant mother looked frail, her eyes hollow and distant. But Evelyn noticed something else. A necklace around Margaret's neck. It was the locket Evelyn had found in the attic. She never stopped loving him, Evelyn whispered, tears streaming down her face. Clara placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. She carried her love for Hiram, even here, but one question still lingered. How had Margaret left the asylum? As Evelyn continued to search, she found an unsigned letter tucked inside the file. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were clear. Margaret, you don't belong here. I've arranged for your release under the condition that you never return to Charleston. A car will be waiting for you on November 3rd. This is your chance to start anew. Please take it. Evelyn's mind raced. Who had written the letter? And where had her mother gone after leaving the asylum? Clara pointed to a scribbled note at the bottom of the file. Transfer facilitated by M. Carter. M. Carter, Evelyn repeated. Who is that? Clara shrugged. Maybe someone who worked here? Evelyn made a note to investigate further. The sun was setting as they left Ashford Asylum, its shadow stretching long over the overgrown grounds. Evelyn felt a mix of grief and determination. Her mother's story was clearer now, but there were still gaps. Who had orchestrated her release? And why had they insisted she never return to Charleston? Back at the hotel, Evelyn began making calls, starting with historical societies and local records offices. After hours of dead ends, she finally reached a man who had worked at Ashford in its final years. M. Carter, the man said, his voice crackling over the phone. That was Mary Carter. She was a nurse at the asylum. Do you know if she's still alive? Evelyn asked, holding her breath. I think so, the man replied. Last I heard, she was living in Savannah. The chapter ends with Evelyn packing her bags for Savannah, determined to find Mary Carter and uncover the final chapter of her mother's story. But as she closes her suitcase, she notices something out of place. A single white envelope on the bedside table. Her name is written on the front in delicate handwriting. Evelyn opens it, her hands trembling. Inside is a single sheet of paper with a message that sends chills down her spine. Some secrets are better left buried. The morning air in Savannah was warm, carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby coast. Evelyn Carmichael gripped the mysterious note in her hand, her mind racing. Some secrets are better left buried. Who had left it? How had they known where she was staying? More importantly, what were they warning her against uncovering? Her resolve hadn't wavered. She had come this far and nothing, not cryptic threats nor the weight of the truth, would stop her from finding out what had happened to her mother. Mary Carter was the key. Evelyn arrived at a modest retirement community tucked between ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. The building was clean and cheerful, with bright flowers lining the walkway. A friendly receptionist guided her to Mary Carter's room, a small but cozy space adorned with photographs and knickknacks. Mary, a woman in her late 90s, sat in a chair by the window, her white hair pinned back neatly. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent despite her age, narrowed as Evelyn introduced herself. Carmichael, Mary said, her voice quavering. It's been a long time since I heard that name. Evelyn sat across from her, clutching the journal she had brought as a visual aid. I believe you helped my mother, Margaret Carmichael, leave Ashford Asylum. I need to know what happened to her. Mary's gaze dropped to her hands, which trembled slightly in her lap. I always wondered if someone would come asking about her, she said softly. But I wasn't sure if it would be out of curiosity or vengeance. Evelyn leaned forward. Please, I just want the truth." Mary sighed, her expression shadowed by memories. "Your mother was one of the kindest souls I ever met. But she was broken. Ashford was no place for her. It wasn't a hospital. It was a prison for people society didn't want to deal with. She didn't belong there." Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat. Then why was she there? Mary looked out the window, her gaze distant. "Your father. He was a powerful man, wasn't he? He pulled strings to have her committed after Hiram Blackwell disappeared. Said it was for her mental well-being, but we all knew better. He wanted to silence her." Evelyn's breath caught. Silence her? Why? "She knew too much," Mary said simply. Mary recounted the months Margaret had spent at Ashford, how she had cried herself to sleep, how she had refused to eat at times, how she had clung to the locket around her neck as though it were her lifeline. "I couldn't stand to see her like that," Mary said. "I knew I had to get her out, but it wasn't easy. Your father's reach extended even into Ashford. That's why I wrote the letter and arranged for her release in secret." "Do you know where she went?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling with hope. Mary hesitated before nodding. "I sent her to a small town in the mountains, Black Hollow, North Carolina. There was a safe house there, a place for women starting over. She wanted to take you with her, but—" Mary's voice faltered, and she looked away. "But what?" Evelyn pressed. "Your father threatened her," Mary said, her tone heavy with regret. "He told her that if she took you, he'd hunt her down and make sure neither of you survived. She believed him." Evelyn's heart broke at the thought of her mother making such a terrible choice. Mary handed Evelyn an address written on a scrap of paper. "I don't know if she stayed there, but this is where she was supposed to go. If you're lucky, someone there might remember her." Evelyn thanked Mary and stood to leave, but Mary caught her arm. "There's one more thing you should know," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother wasn't the only one in danger. I overheard your father talking to someone, a man named Victor Hanley. They were plotting something. I don't know the details, but it sounded sinister." "Victor Hanley?" Evelyn repeated, committing the name to memory. Mary nodded. "Be careful, Evelyn. The Carmichael name casts a long shadow, even now." As Evelyn left the retirement home, her mind swirled with questions. Who was Victor Hanley? What had he and her father been plotting? And how far would she have to go to find the answers? The journey to Black Hollow was long and winding. The small town nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains was picturesque, with its quaint shops and friendly locals. Evelyn found the address Mary had given her. It was an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, now converted into a community center. Inside, Evelyn spoke with a middle-aged woman named Lila, who managed the center. "Margaret Carmichael?" Lila said, furrowing her brow. "That name sounds familiar, but I'll need to check our records." Lila disappeared into the back office and returned moments later with an old ledger. She flipped through the pages before stopping at one and pointing. "Here," she said. "Margaret Carmichael arrived in November of 1947. But she didn't stay long. She left abruptly in early 1948. Did she say where she was going?" Evelyn asked. Lila shook her head. "No, but there's a note here that says she left with someone named Victor Hanley. Does that mean anything to you?" Evelyn's blood ran cold. Victor Hanley, the man Mary had warned her about. As Evelyn drove back to her hotel, her thoughts churned. Why had her mother left with Victor Hanley? Was it voluntary, or had she been coerced? And what role had her father played in all of this? When she arrived at the hotel, another envelope was waiting for her at the front desk. Her name was written on the front in the same delicate handwriting as the previous note. Inside was a single piece of paper. "You've gone far enough. Turn back now or you'll regret it." The chapter ends with Evelyn staring at the note, her determination unshaken but her sense of danger growing. Someone didn't want her uncovering the truth. But Evelyn was more certain than ever. She wouldn't stop until she found her mother. The handwritten threat was more than just a warning. It was a challenge, one Evelyn Carmichael had no intention of ignoring. Someone was trying to frighten her into abandoning her search. But instead of fear, the note fueled her resolve. Whoever had sent it didn't understand Evelyn's nature. She had survived loss, grief, and decades of questions. Nothing would deter her now. The following morning, Evelyn sat in a quiet corner of the hotel cafe. The note spread out beside her as she sipped her coffee. She couldn't shake the name Victor Hanley from her thoughts. Why had her mother left Black Hollow with him? And what connection did he have to her father? Evelyn decided it was time to bring in reinforcements. She called Melissa, her daughter, who had been her rock throughout this journey. "Nam, are you okay?" Melissa asked, her tone laced with concern. "I'm fine," Evelyn replied, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. "But I need your help. I need you to look into a man named Victor Hanley. I don't have much, just his name and the fact that he was involved with your grandfather." Melissa hesitated. "I'll do what I can. But, Mom, are you sure about all this? It sounds dangerous." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Dangerous, maybe. Necessary, definitely." While waiting for Melissa to dig up information, Evelyn decided to visit the local library to research the Carmichael name. She combed through newspaper archives and public records, searching for any mention of her father's business dealings or connections to Victor Hanley. An old article from 1948 caught her attention. Prominent Charleston businessman Arthur Carmichael partners with Victor Hanley on controversial development project. The article detailed plans for a luxury resort in the mountains, but the project had been abandoned after Hanley vanished under mysterious circumstances. Mysterious circumstances, Evelyn murmured. It was a phrase that seemed to follow everyone connected to her father. That evening, Melissa called back. Her voice was tight with urgency. "Mom, I found something," Melissa said. "Victor Hanley wasn't just a business associate of Grandpa's. He was a fixer, a man who handled messy situations for powerful people. And there's more." "What?" Evelyn asked, gripping the phone tightly. "He disappeared in 1948. No records, no sightings. It's like he just vanished into thin air." Evelyn's stomach churned. "And you think he might have been involved with my mother?" "It's possible," Melissa said cautiously. "But Mom, if Hanley was as dangerous as he seems, you need to be careful. You're not just digging up old secrets. You're stepping into a minefield." Evelyn's next step was clear. She had to find out what happened to Victor Hanley and why her mother had left with him. Her search led her to a long-abandoned property on the outskirts of Charleston. A sprawling estate Hanley had purchased shortly before his disappearance. The house was derelict, its windows shattered and its roof sagging under the weight of neglect. Evelyn felt a pang of unease as she approached the front door, but she pressed on, determined to find answers. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Evelyn explored cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The house was a labyrinth of rooms, each filled with remnants of a life left behind. Broken furniture, scattered papers, and shattered glass. In what appeared to be an office, Evelyn found a safe embedded in the wall. The door was slightly ajar, its contents long since looted, but a single folder remained inside. Evelyn opened it carefully, her hands trembling. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white images of her mother, Margaret, sitting with Victor Hanley. Margaret's expression was tense, her body language guarded. Hanley, on the other hand, looked composed and in control. Beneath the photographs was a handwritten note, dated March 1948. "Margaret is under my protection now. If anyone comes looking for her, there will be consequences." Evelyn's breath caught. Why had Hanley taken such a personal interest in her mother? Was it genuine concern, or something more sinister? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Evelyn froze, her heart pounding. The house had been empty, or so she thought. Slowly, she stepped back into the shadows, clutching the folder to her chest. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the creak of floorboards. Evelyn peered around the corner and saw a man in his 40s, dressed in dark clothing, moving through the house with purpose. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Was this the person who had left the notes? The man stopped in the office, his eyes scanning the room. Evelyn held her breath, pressing herself against the wall. She watched as he picked up a torn piece of paper from the desk, read it, and slipped it into his pocket. Evelyn's foot brushed against a loose piece of wood, and the sound made the man turn sharply. "Who's there?" he called, his voice low and threatening. Evelyn didn't answer. She crouched lower, her heart racing as the man moved closer. When he stepped into the hallway, Evelyn seized the moment to dart out of the office and toward the front door. The man shouted, his footsteps pounding behind her, but Evelyn was quicker. She burst out of the house and into the fading daylight, her breath coming in gasps. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Back at her hotel, Evelyn locked the door and sat down with the folder. The photographs and note raised more questions than they answered, but one thing was clear. Someone didn't want her uncovering the truth. As she sifted through the documents again, she noticed something she had missed. A small, faded map tucked between the pages. It showed a secluded cabin deep in the woods, marked with the initials VH. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Could this be where Victor Hanley had taken her mother? The chapter ends with Evelyn staring at the map, her determination unshaken despite the growing danger. She knew she was getting closer to the truth. But at what cost? Evelyn Carmichael studied the map with the intensity of someone unraveling a lifetime of mysteries. The cabin marked VH was deep in the wilderness, accessible only by a network of unmarked trails. It was isolated, far from the prying eyes of society, and likely the last place where her mother, Margaret, had been seen. The thought of her mother spending her final days in a remote cabin filled Evelyn with both dread and resolve. With every step closer to the truth, the danger surrounding her intensified. But this was no time to turn back. The drive to the woods took hours, the highways giving way to narrow, winding roads flanked by towering pines. Evelyn stopped at a general store in the nearest town to gather supplies. A flashlight, extra batteries, and a sturdy pair of boots. "You heading out to the trails?" the cashier asked as he rang up her purchases. "Something like that," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice casual. "Be careful," he said, his tone wary. "The woods around here can be tricky. People get lost out there all the time." Evelyn forced a smile and thanked him before heading back to her car. The trailhead marked the beginning of her journey into the unknown. The woods were dense, the trees forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into fragmented beams. Evelyn followed the map carefully, each step taking her deeper into the silence. Hours passed, and the trail grew more treacherous. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and moss, and the air grew cooler as she climbed higher into the hills. Evelyn's breath came in short bursts, but she pressed on, driven by the thought of her mother waiting at the end of this path. Finally, she saw it. The cabin was small and weathered, its wooden exterior gray with age. Ivy crept up the walls, and the windows were dark. Evelyn approached cautiously, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The door was slightly ajar. Evelyn hesitated, then pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of decay. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like veils in the corners. Evelyn shone her flashlight around the room, her heart sinking as she took in the scene. The cabin had been abandoned for years. Furniture lay toppled, papers were scattered across the floor, and the fireplace was cold and empty. But amid the chaos, Evelyn spotted something that made her pause. A small photograph on the mantelpiece. She picked it up carefully, her breath catching in her throat. It was a picture of her mother, Margaret, standing beside Victor Hanley. Margaret looked tired but resolute, while Hanley's expression was inscrutable. Evelyn's search of the cabin uncovered more clues. A journal lay on the kitchen table, its cover cracked and faded. Inside, the entries were written in a neat, deliberate hand. March 10th, 1948. Margaret is here with me now. She's safe, but her spirit is broken. She talks about Evelyn constantly, about the life she left behind. I'm trying to help her heal, but the shadows of her past are relentless. April 2nd, 1948. Arthur's men are closing in. They've been asking questions in town, trying to find her. Margaret is terrified, but I won't let them take her. If they come here, they'll have to go through me. May 15th, 1948. She's gone. Margaret left in the middle of the night, leaving only a note. She said she couldn't bear to put me in danger. I don't know where she's gone, but I pray she finds peace. Evelyn's chest tightened. Her mother had left the cabin voluntarily, but where had she gone? And why? As Evelyn sat on the edge of the dusty bed, the sound of footsteps outside shattered the silence. She froze, her heart pounding as the footsteps grew louder. She grabbed her flashlight and moved toward the door, her mind racing. Who could it be? The man from the abandoned estate? The door creaked open, and a shadowy figure stepped inside. Evelyn raised the flashlight, illuminating a man's face, lined with age but unmistakably familiar. "Who are you?" Evelyn demanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The man hesitated before speaking. "You're Evelyn, aren't you? Margaret's daughter." Evelyn's grip on the flashlight tightened. "How do you know who I am?" "I'm Victor Hanley," the man said. Evelyn's mind reeled. Hanley had vanished decades ago, yet here he stood, alive and very much real. "Why are you here?" Evelyn asked, her voice shaking. "What happened to my mother?" Hanley's expression softened. "I came back to the cabin because I knew you'd find it eventually. I've been waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" Evelyn repeated, her disbelief evident. "Margaret always believed you'd come looking for her," Hanley said. "She asked me to leave something for you, but I never got the chance. Until now." Hanley reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Evelyn, his gaze steady. Evelyn opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter written in her mother's handwriting. "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means you've found the courage to seek the truth. I'm sorry for all the pain my choices have caused you. I left Charleston to protect you from your father's wrath, and I left Victor to protect him from the same. But I've never stopped loving you. I had to go far away to escape the shadows of our past. Please know that every choice I made was out of love. I only hope you can forgive me." Tears blurred Evelyn's vision as she read the letter. "Where did she go?" she asked, her voice breaking. Hanley hesitated. "She wanted to disappear completely. She went to a convent in Vermont, a place where she could find peace. I don't know if she's still there, but it's where she intended to start over." Evelyn's emotions swirled. Relief, grief, and determination mingling together. The letter answered many questions but left her with one final mission. The chapter ends as Evelyn drives away from the cabin, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. Her journey isn't over, but the path ahead is clear. She must find the convent and discover whether her mother is still alive. The drive to Vermont was long and arduous, the rolling hills and winding roads providing little comfort to Evelyn Carmichael. Her thoughts were consumed by her mother's letter and the possibilities it represented. Could Margaret still be alive, hidden away in the safety of a convent? Or had Evelyn's search come too late? The letter had named the place Quiet Waters Convent, a secluded community of nuns dedicated to prayer, healing, and providing refuge for those seeking solace. Evelyn had called ahead, leaving a message explaining her connection to Margaret Carmichael. The voice on the other end had been polite but non-committal, promising to check their records. As Evelyn approached the convent, nestled in a picturesque valley surrounded by dense woods, her heart raced. The simple stone building exuded an air of serenity, its weathered walls bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. Evelyn parked her car and approached the large wooden doors, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestone path. She knocked twice, her pulse pounding in her ears. After a moment, the door creaked open, and a woman in a simple gray habit appeared. Her face was kind but guarded. "Mrs. Carmichael?" the woman asked. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her voice trembling. "I'm here to ask about my mother, Margaret Carmichael." The woman stepped aside, gesturing for Evelyn to enter. "I'm Sister Catherine. Please, follow me." Sister Catherine led Evelyn through the quiet halls of the convent. The air was cool, filled with the faint scent of incense. They stopped in a small sitting room, where Catherine gestured for Evelyn to sit. "We received your message," Sister Catherine began. "And I must tell you that Margaret Carmichael did stay here many years ago. She arrived in the spring of 1948 and remained with us for nearly 2 decades. Evelyn's breath caught. 2 decades? She stayed here that long. Catherine nodded. Margaret was a deeply private woman, burdened by grief and guilt. She sought solace in our community, and over time, she became one of us. One of you, Evelyn repeated. She took vows and became Sister Margaret, Catherine explained. She devoted herself to a life of service and prayer. Evelyn struggled to process the revelation. Her mother, who had once been a vibrant and social woman, had chosen a life of isolation and devotion. Why didn't she contact me? Evelyn asked, her voice breaking. She often spoke of you, Catherine said gently, but she believed that reaching out would put you in danger. She thought it was better to let you live a life free of the shadows that haunted her. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. Where is she now? Can I see her? Catherine's expression turned somber. I'm sorry, Mrs. Carmichael. Sister Margaret passed away 10 years ago. The room seemed to tilt as Evelyn absorbed the news. Her mother was gone. The hope that had carried her across state lines, through dusty archives, and into forgotten cabins, crumbled in an instant. She's buried here, Catherine said softly, in our cemetery under her chosen name. If you'd like, I can take you to her. Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. The cemetery was a small, peaceful garden behind the convent, surrounded by tall trees that rustled in the breeze. Sister Catherine led Evelyn to a modest headstone that read, Sister Margaret, 1923 to 2013, beloved servant of peace. Evelyn knelt before the grave, her tears falling freely. She placed a trembling hand on the stone, her mind flooding with memories of her mother's laughter, her gentle touch, and the love that had always been present, even when unspoken. I found you, Evelyn whispered. I'm so sorry it took me so long. As Evelyn sat by the grave, Sister Catherine approached with a small box. Sister Margaret left this with us, she said. She asked that it be given to you if you ever came looking for her. Evelyn opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was the locket she had found in the attic, polished and gleaming as though it had been cared for daily. Beside it was a bundle of letters, each addressed to Evelyn. The first letter began, My dearest Evelyn, every day, I prayed that you would find the happiness I couldn't give you. My love for you never wavered, even as the years stretched on. I wish I could have been there for you, but I hope these words bring you some measure of comfort. You were, and always will be, my greatest joy. Evelyn spent hours reading the letters, each one a testament to her mother's unwavering love. Margaret had poured her heart onto the pages, recounting memories of Evelyn's childhood and expressing her hopes and dreams for her daughter's future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn felt a profound sense of peace. Her mother's physical presence was gone, but her spirit lingered in every word, in every memory. Before leaving, Evelyn placed the locket back in the box and whispered a final goodbye. As Evelyn returned to the convent's main hall, Sister Catherine stopped her. There's something else you should know, Catherine said. Before she passed, Sister Margaret mentioned a man, Victor Hanley. She said he had come to see her many years ago, seeking forgiveness for what had happened. She forgave him, but she asked me to warn you. Not everyone involved in their story sought redemption. Evelyn's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I don't know, Catherine admitted. But Margaret believed that your father's secrets ran deeper than even she understood. The chapter ends with Evelyn leaving the convent, her mother's love a comforting presence, but the mystery of her father's deeds still looming. She knows there is one last piece of the puzzle to uncover, one that could either bring closure or reignite the shadows of the past. Evelyn Carmichael drove through the winding roads of Vermont with a heavy heart. The revelations at the convent had brought both peace and pain. Her mother, Margaret, had found refuge and a new life, but the mysteries surrounding her father's role in Hiram Blackwell's death and Victor Hanley's involvement still lingered. Margaret's warning through Sister Catherine echoed in Evelyn's mind. Not everyone sought redemption. If that was true, who was still guarding the secrets of the Carmichael family? And why? Evelyn's destination was Charleston, the city that had been the epicenter of her family's tangled past. Her plan was simple: confront the remnants of her father's legacy and uncover the final truth. Upon arriving in Charleston, Evelyn checked into a small bed and breakfast. Her room overlooked the harbor, a serene view that contrasted with the storm raging inside her mind. After settling in, she retrieved the documents she had collected throughout her journey: Hiram's journal, her father's confession, and the photographs from Victor Hanley's cabin. Each piece painted part of a picture, but the whole truth remained elusive. Evelyn placed a call to Melissa. "Mom, are you back in Charleston?" Melissa asked. "Yes," Evelyn replied. "I need you to do something for me." "What is it?" "I need you to find out who controls the Carmichael estate now. If there's anyone who worked with your grandfather or still oversees the family's affairs, I need to talk to them." Melissa hesitated. "Do you think they'll be honest with you?" Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "If they aren't, I'll make sure they don't have a choice." The next day, Melissa called back with the information Evelyn needed. The Carmichael estate is now under the management of a law firm called Hanley and Moore, Melissa said. Evelyn froze. "Hanley?" "Yes," Melissa replied. "It's run by Victor Hanley's son, Douglas." Evelyn's mind raced. Victor Hanley had vanished in 1948, but his family had remained entwined with hers. Was Douglas Hanley involved in the decades-long effort to bury the truth? Evelyn scheduled a meeting with Douglas Hanley, posing as a client interested in selling a property tied to the Carmichael estate. She arrived at the firm's office, a sleek building in downtown Charleston, with her documents carefully tucked into her bag. Douglas was a man in his late 40s, his tailored suit and polished demeanor radiating confidence. He greeted Evelyn warmly, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes when she introduced herself. "Evelyn Carmichael," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "A pleasure. What can I do for you?" Evelyn didn't waste time. She placed her father's confession and Hiram's journal on the desk. "I think you already know," she said, her tone icy. Douglas's expression didn't falter, but his eyes darted to the documents. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "Don't insult my intelligence," Evelyn snapped. "Your father was Victor Hanley. He was involved in my family's darkest secrets. And now you're running the firm that has kept those secrets buried." Douglas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You've done your homework," he admitted. "But I don't see how any of this concerns you." Evelyn's voice hardened. "It concerns me because my mother's life was destroyed by my father's actions, and by your father's complicity. I want the truth, Mr. Hanley. All of it." Douglas's composure cracked. He leaned forward, his voice low and tense. "You don't understand what you're asking for," he said. "There are things about your family that should stay buried." "Why?" Evelyn demanded. "Because they might ruin your firm's reputation? Or because they might finally give my mother the justice she deserved?" Douglas hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. You want the truth? I'll give it to you. But don't say I didn't warn you." Douglas opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick file. He slid it across the desk to Evelyn. "Everything you're looking for is in there," he said. "Your father's dealings with mine, the bribes, the threats, and the cover-up." Evelyn opened the file and began reading. Her stomach churned as she absorbed the details. Her father had orchestrated Hiram Blackwell's murder, using Victor Hanley to arrange the details and ensure silence. The payment had been substantial, enough to buy Hanley's loyalty for years. But the most shocking revelation was buried in the final pages. A contract signed by her father and Victor Hanley, agreeing to commit Margaret to Ashford Asylum. "Your mother was a threat," Douglas said quietly. "She knew too much, and your father couldn't risk her exposing him. My father arranged for her commitment, but he regretted it later. That's why he helped her escape." Evelyn's hands shook as she closed the file. "And you've kept this hidden all these years?" Douglas met her gaze, his expression somber. "I didn't inherit my father's sins, Mrs. Carmichael, but I inherited his responsibilities. I've spent my career protecting the legacy he left behind, whether I wanted to or not." Evelyn stood, clutching the file tightly. "Your father might have had regrets, but that doesn't absolve him or you. I'm going to make sure the world knows what my father and your family did." Douglas's expression darkened. "Be careful, Mrs. Carmichael. The truth is a powerful weapon, but it can also destroy you." Evelyn didn't flinch. "Let it." That evening, Evelyn returned to her hotel room and began piecing together the final narrative of her family's past. She drafted a letter to a prominent journalist, attaching copies of the most damning documents. As she sealed the envelope, there was a knock at her door. Evelyn hesitated, her heart racing as she approached the door. When she opened it, she found a man standing there, his face shadowed by the dim hallway light. "Mrs. Carmichael?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Yes," Evelyn replied warily. "I have a message for you," the man said, handing her a small envelope. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away. Evelyn opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words. "You were warned." The chapter ends with Evelyn staring at the note, her resolve unshaken despite the looming threat. She knows the final confrontation is near, and she is ready for it. Evelyn Carmichael stood at the crossroads of her family's history and her own future. The note delivered to her door, "You were warned," hung in the air like an unspoken threat. Yet, instead of fear, she felt a steely determination. She had uncovered the truth behind her father's sins and her mother's suffering, and she would not let those who perpetuated the lies and injustices escape accountability. The next morning, Evelyn made her final preparations. The envelope containing the damning documents and her own account of the Carmichael family's buried crimes was sent to a trusted journalist at the Charleston Observer. She had included copies of every critical piece of evidence: her father's confession, Hiram Blackwell's journal, and the details of Margaret's forced commitment to Ashford Asylum. That afternoon, Evelyn received a call from Melissa. "Mom, are you okay? I saw the story online. It's everywhere." Evelyn's heart raced. "Already? They published it an hour ago," Melissa said. "It's huge. Reporters are calling the law firm, demanding answers. And Mom, there's something you should know. Douglas Hanley resigned this morning. He said he wouldn't fight the truth." Evelyn felt a wave of relief but also a pang of sympathy. Douglas had been complicit in protecting his father's legacy, but he had also been a man bound by a past he didn't create. As Evelyn hung up the phone, there was a knock at her hotel door. She hesitated, the weight of the recent threats heavy on her mind. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door to find Douglas Hanley standing there, a somber expression on his face. "May I come in?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, stepping aside. Douglas sat across from her, his polished demeanor now replaced with quiet resignation. "I read the article," he began. "You did what you had to do." "I did what my mother deserved," Evelyn said firmly. "She sacrificed everything, and it's time the world knew the truth." Douglas sighed. "You've upended my life, but you're right. The sins of our fathers have weighed on me for decades. Maybe it's time I stopped carrying them." Evelyn studied him, her voice softening. "If you truly want to make amends, Douglas, you can help me honor the people your father and mine destroyed. My mother, Hiram Blackwell, they deserve more than just an article. They deserve justice." Douglas nodded. "What do you have in mind?" The next few weeks were a whirlwind of public scrutiny and revelations. The Charleston Observer's expose ignited a firestorm, leading to investigations into Arthur Carmichael's business dealings and Victor Hanley's role as his enforcer. Families affected by their actions came forward, sharing their own stories of betrayal and loss. Evelyn worked tirelessly with Douglas to establish a foundation in Margaret and Hiram's names, dedicated to supporting those who had been silenced or marginalized by powerful figures. The foundation became a beacon of hope, its mission a direct response to the pain Evelyn had uncovered. One sunny afternoon, Evelyn visited her mother's grave at Quiet Waters Convent. She knelt before the headstone, the peace of the garden settling over her. "I did it, Mom," she whispered. "I told the world your story. I told them about Hiram, about what you endured. I hope you're proud." She placed the locket she had carried throughout her journey on the grave, a final gesture of love and closure. As she stood, she felt a sense of lightness she hadn't known in years. Her search for the truth had been grueling, but it had also been transformative. She had uncovered not only her mother's story, but also her own strength. Back in Charleston, Evelyn walked through her childhood home, now transformed into a museum dedicated to the Carmichael family's complicated legacy. The exhibits celebrated Margaret's courage, Hiram's integrity, and the lives of those who had fought against oppression and injustice. Evelyn paused before a photograph of her mother, taken during her time at the convent. Her eyes sparkled with quiet strength, her face serene. "You were right to fight for us," Evelyn whispered. "And now, I'm fighting for you." The story concludes with Evelyn standing on the steps of the museum, her daughter Melissa and her grandchildren beside her. As the sun set over Charleston, Evelyn felt the weight of her family's past lift, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The final lines of Margaret's letter echoed in her mind. "You were, and always will be, my greatest joy." The Carmichael legacy had been rewritten, not as a tale of power and corruption, but as a testament to love, resilience, and redemption.